Today, we're going to talk about Mary Wollstonecraft. She was a writer and philosopher with ideas so radical for her time, well, they were pretty much buried for an entire century. Her story is absolutely incredible. It's about a brilliant mind, pure defiance, and a legacy that, honestly, still challenges us today. So, when you hear the phrase, the mother of feminism, who comes to mind? It's a huge title, right? And look, while a lot of people played a part, Mary Wollstonecraft has one of the strongest claims to it. But here's the catch. As you're about to find out, her life was way too complex, way too controversial to ever fit neatly on a pedestal. And this quote, this is the heart of her entire revolution. I do not wish them to have power over men, but over themselves. It's from her most famous book, which came out way back in 1792, and it just gets right to the point. This wasn't about women dominating men. It was about women having autonomy, control over their own lives. Her big argument? Women aren't naturally inferior, they've just been systematically denied an education. And let me be clear, this book wasn't some gentle suggestion. It was basically a philosophical bombshell. Wollstonecraft was imagining a whole new society, one built on reason, where women were treated like rational human beings, not just emotional decorations. This was a full-on assault on the entire social structure of the 18th century. So you gotta ask, where does an idea that radical even come from? Well, to understand her philosophy, you really have to understand her life. These weren't theories she dreamed up in a quiet study. Oh no, they were forged in defiance. From the very beginning, she saw male tyranny up close and personal. Her father was abusive and wasted all the family's money. When she was just a teenager, she would literally sleep on the floor outside her mother's bedroom to try and protect her from beatings. Later, she masterminded her sister's escape from an abusive husband, an act that was just completely scandalous at the time. Every move she made was a rebellion against the structures that trapped the women she loved. And here she is. Just look at that portrait. That gaze tells you a lot, doesn't it? She decided to reject all the expected paths and support herself with her own writing, vowing to become, in her own words, the first of a new genus, a professional female intellectual, a category of person that didn't really even exist yet. And just how radical was that decision? Well, think about it. For a respectable woman in the 1780s, these were pretty much your options. You could be a companion, a governess, a school teacher, or a wife. See the common thread? Every single one of those jobs made you dependent on men. So for her to choose to be an author, she was choosing a life of financial uncertainty and social scandal. It was a massive gamble. But Wollstonecraft didn't just write about revolution, she went looking for it. She packed her bags and threw herself right into the heart of the French Revolution, moving to Paris in 1792, right as things were about to get incredibly violent. And while she was there, she was fighting an intellectual war. You had powerful conservative thinkers back in England like Edmund Burke, who described the women marching on Versailles as furies from hell. But Wollstonecraft, who was actually there, she fired right back. She said they weren't monsters. They were fishmongers and mothers who couldn't afford bread to feed their kids. She saw the human reality, not the political theater. And in Paris, she lived her ideas to the fullest. She fell into a passionate love affair with an American adventurer named Gilbert Emily. They had a daughter, Fanny. And they did all of this without ever getting married. I mean, think about the guts that took. It was a radical act of freedom in the middle of a war zone. But this experiment in love ended in absolute disaster. Imlay just left her, abandoned her and their baby. She was completely devastated. This suicide note she wrote is just heartbreaking. Let my wrongs sleep with me. I shall plunge into the Thames. It's the sound of a mind that's been pushed to the absolute brink. But even here, she's extraordinary. After she was rescued from the river, she didn't apologize. She actually defended her actions, calling the attempt one of the calmest acts of reason. She was insisting on her right to have power over her own life, even her own death. And that's the complexity of Mary Wollstonecraft, right there. A fiercely rational intellect and profound emotional vulnerability, all at once. She eventually returns to London and finds a brief final period of happiness. But ironically, this is the part of her life that would lead to her reputation being almost completely destroyed for the next 100 years. Back in London, she reconnected with the philosopher William Godwin. They fell in love, and even though they both had philosophical problems with marriage, they got married when she became pregnant.
They had a daughter, also named Mary, who, you might have heard of, would grow up to write Frankenstein.
But their happiness was tragically short. Just 11 days. That's it. 11 days after giving birth, Mary Wollstonecraft was dead from septicemia, an infection from the childbirth. She was only 38 years old. Her husband, Godwin, was utterly grief-stricken. He decided the best way to honor his brilliant wife was to write a memoir about her life. He intended it to be a raw, honest, and loving portrait. Instead, it became a public relations catastrophe. You see, Godwin was a radical who believed in total honesty, so he put everything in the book. Her daughter born outside of marriage, her passionate love affairs, her suicide attempts, her religious doubts, all of it. To the public of 1798, this wasn't an honest portrait of a complex woman. It was a scandalous laundry list of her sins. The backlash was immediate and just vicious. One critic accused Godwin of having a want of all feeling in stripping his dead wife naked. His loving tribute was seen as a complete betrayal. And just like that, Wollstonecraft, the brilliant advocate for women's reason, was turned into a cautionary tale. Her work was effectively canceled. But an idea as powerful as hers couldn't stay buried forever. It would take almost a full century, but her work was eventually rediscovered by a new generation of women who were fighting their own battles. By the turn of the 20th century, you have the leaders of the suffrage movement. They were looking for a hero, a foremother for their cause. And they found her in Mary Wollstonecraft. They basically rehabilitated her reputation, started reprinting her work, and claimed her as the intellectual godmother of the fight for the vote. And her influence didn't stop there. You can trace a line from her to early American feminists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to modernist writers like Virginia Woolf, all the way to contemporary figures like the Nobel-winning economist Amartya Sen and the activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Her ideas on reason and rights are still resonating. And she still has the power to provoke a debate. On the left, you see a pretty traditional plaque honoring her book. On the right, a very controversial modern sculpture unveiled in 2020. It was supposed to embody her spirit, but it sparked a huge public argument. So yeah, over 200 years later, she's still forcing us to ask difficult questions. Which really brings us to our final question for today. Her life brings up a critical issue. What do we do with pioneers whose personal lives are as radical and, let's be honest, as messy as their ideas? How do we honor their genius without sanitizing the very defiance that made them who they were?